Welcome back, European history connoisseurs. We are continuing in this presentation the introduction of the ever so trendy topic of historical period 2. And in that topic, the subtopic we focus again today is absolutism. In the last episode, we talked about the background of absolutism in theory and thought, from the new monarchs like Ferdinand and Isabella to Henry VII in England, as well as Charles and then Louis XI in France. But in this episode, we're going to take a deeper look at how French absolutism morphed into the quintessential example of absolute monarchy, and that of Louis XIV. So the seeds of absolutism actually started way back in history with Henry IV. He laid the foundation of France becoming the premier world power by the 17th century. He did so by encouraging French colonization of the New World. He strengthened government institutions through education, universities, local government called Parliament, and the Treasury. Edict of Nantes, as we already have indicated, provided religious tolerance to the Huguenots and brought about a sense of economic stability and political stability for that matter. He also weakened the nobility, as all centralized monarchs aim to do, and in doing so he had the old nobility, known as the nobles of the sword, and he prohibited them from really influencing the crown in any way, shape, or form. And then he also furthered the split here by creating the nobles of the robe, which was the new nobility who in many cases purchased titles from the crown and became high government officials who were extremely loyal and grateful for their new high position. An example of this would be the Duke of Sully. The Duke of Sully was Henry IV's financial minister. Sully's reform will really make strides in increasing the power of the monarchy in France. So how did he do this? He adopted mercantilism, and the state's role in the economy exponentially increased in order to achieve a favorable trade balance. We've talked about mercantilism already as an economic policy. He also granted monopolies to powerful people, many of them nobles of the robe, to produce gunpowder and salt. And he also encouraged manufacturing of silks and tapestries. So some high-order, high-end, if you will, manufacturing. And only the government under Sully could own and operate mines. He also reduced royal debt, which was in contrast to their neighbors in Spain who were drowning in debt. Especially they're going to exponentially go higher into debt as they increase their influence in the 30 Years' War. But also he reformed the tax system and he made it more efficient and equitable. And he will also enhance infrastructure, trying to develop a nationwide highway system. He also implements canals, which link major rivers and increase internal trade, and also a canal to link the Mediterranean to the Atlantic. So again, facilitating trade was really, really good for the economy. Sully and Henry concentrated on building back the French economy that had been devastated during the wars of religion and civil wars that plagued France. So thus, for the most part, Sully and Henry will try to avoid at all cost foreign entanglements. All good things come to an end, and a monk, an angry monk, who was hell-bent on getting revenge on Henry for granting the Edict of Nantes and providing the Protestants the right to worship, assassinated Henry IV. So we had a power crisis develop again, and Henry's widow, Marie de Medici, will serve as regent for the most part until Louis XIII comes of age. Now again, Marie Medici was his second wife, and obviously you can tell by her last name that his motive for marriage might have been financial. And again, the Grand Duke of Tuscany, again a Medici, gave him a large dowry in the form of forgiving his debts for marrying young Marie de Medici, who was actually 20 years Henry's junior. But the marriage was also productive because Marie bore him 5 children in 8 years. Now, her regency will be marked with corruption, and in some cases, the nobility actually started to gain power back. She was encouraged to exile with Louis XIII, and another power crisis, like I said, emerged. However, that power crisis will be averted. How? Cardinal Richelieu. That's how. And it was under Richelieu's guidance as regent that France and their absolutism version was perfected. Again, if you remember, we talked about Richelieu in the 30 Years' War. It's kind of a politique in that he put the affairs of the state and the power of the king over that of religion at that particular time. So a couple things here about Louis XIII and Cardinal Richelieu. You have the raison d'etat, which is an overriding concern, usually the interests of the country's concerns, that justifies political or diplomatic action that might otherwise be considered reprehensible. And again, in U.S. history, it's kind of like when presidents during wars will suspend the writ of habeas corpus. Abraham Lincoln did that during the Civil War. You could also say this is very Machiavellian, but whatever means possible, we need to put the interests of the country and the crown over that of the individual people. So remember the raison d'etat. Intendants. This is really one of the biggest contributions of Richelieu, and it refers to the order of a public administrative office. The intendants were sent locally to supervise and enforce the king's will in the local provinces, and they had jurisdiction over three areas: finances, policing, and justice. They were loyal only to the king, and they were appointed by the king. And again, they were usually young members of the middle class and the nobles of the robe. And this became a symbol of royal centralization and absolutism. And under it, the government became highly efficient and very, very centralized. So the intendants and the nobles of the robe and their participation in this were key to the development of French absolutism. Make sure you know that. And then La Rochelle. The religious policy will change. The Huguenot policy will change by 1627. And La Rochelle was a bastion for Calvinists. Remember, under the Edict of Nantes, they were allowed to protect and fortify their cities. Well, as the centralized monarchy begins and continues to gain power, the Calvinists and their bastions were really seen as a thorn in the side of the absolute advocate Richelieu and Louis XIII. So what they decided to do was take them out. And so they besieged La Rochelle and subdued the Huguenots with the Peace of Alais in 1629. And basically what happens is they lose their right to have their fortified towns and cities. Now it's important to note that they still were able to worship, but they weren't allowed to heavily fortify themselves and protect themselves from further centralization. Now again, note, we will talk about Louis XIV actually getting rid of the rights of the Huguenots to worship. And then, as we know, the 30 Years' War, because of Richelieu's policies in steering France into the 30 Years' War for political reasons, not so much religion, at the expense of the Habsburgs, really by the end of 1648, France emerges as the premier European world power. Now, under Louis XIV, as you can see, this is under Key Concept 2.1, Roman numeral 1. But after experiencing the uncertainty and turmoil of the Fronde as a youngster, remember, this is the last attempt of the nobility trying to halt the growing centralization and the growing power of the monarchy, Louis XIV really made sure that from that point on, he was going to keep the nobles close to him and loyal to his power. And we're going to talk about the ways in which he did this. So one of the ways he did it was to allow them to keep a lot of their local authority, rights, and privileges, the things that, kind of made them noble. One of the biggest was that they were tax exempt. Now again, that's not going to pay dividends in the long run, as France will go bankrupt, almost bankrupt, due to a lot of Louis XIV's wars. But this kind of kept them off of his back, and then he did some other things too to manipulate them, and I'll describe those in the next couple of slides. In fact, in some cases, you could argue that Louis XIV made the nobles even stronger by assigning them to run his much more organized, centralized government and military. Now again, this is of course in the form of the intendant system that we've already discussed, and also it's important to note that this is mainly the power and influence of the nobles of the robe. Now the nobility and the nobles of the robe ran the bureaucracy in the intendant system and therefore collected taxes, as we said. Sorry for that interruption, little announcement from the office, but again, the nobles of the robe were, collected taxes. Some of the nobles of the sword were also military officers. So again, important to distinguish between the two. He physically, and we'll get into this more in depth when I show you some pictures here, he physically moved all the nobles around him outside of Paris, where he built his extravagant palace of Versailles, which is known as the Versailles system. And again, like I said, we'll get into this in a couple minutes here. But he also commissioned artists and writers and painters to sculpt and write about his glorious leadership, and painted glorious images of him showing his power And it's one of the reasons why they call him the Sun King. Everything revolved around him in his government, in his palace. And also he made sure to censor any criticism or negative imagery. So Louis XIV, like Henry IV, depended on a really, really significant financial minister. This guy's name was Colbert, Jean-Baptiste Colbert, and he also helps Louis bring France under centralized control in the following ways. We've already talked about this one, but administration, taxes, and finances all came through and to Louis XIV's bureaucracy, and they were managed by those loyal nobles who maintained their local rights. Again, this is the intendant system for like the 16th time, and it was introduced initially by Richelieu, when he was serving as regent to Louis XIII, but he used it to weaken the nobility of the sword. And again, we've talked about that he implemented levels of the robe to run this system. He generally selected members of the middle class and then made one per district. There were 32 districts in France, so you had one intendant per district, so 32 of them in all, and they were responsible for policing, financing, and the judicial system in each district. Again, this made the government more efficient, more centralized, and it gave the crown more substantial power, enforceable at the local level, more so than even before. Anyone who protested or resisted would be dealt with by the intendant or the military. Speaking of the military, Louis went about making Europe's largest standing army, and he modeled it after Charles VII and Philip II, and he, again, officered by the loyal nobility. He paid for this through his mercantilistic policies, and France grew into the largest army in Europe. And Louis, you know what? He wasn't afraid to use it. He poured all of his efforts into the military instead of the navy. That's going to be a drawback later on. Laws. Louis XIV had final law-making power, not the Estates General, which is the parliamentary body of France. Anyone who resisted or rebelled would either be crushed by the French military or be taken care of at the local level by the judicial power of the intendant. In terms of religion, Louis considered himself the head of the Catholic Church. While he was very religious, he did not allow the Pope to exercise political power in the French Catholic Church, which is also known as the Gallican Church. Louis XIV officially made France all Catholic by revoking the Edict of Nantes and forcing out the remaining Huguenots. This was done so in the version of the Edict of Fontainebleau in 1685, which again was the official revocation of the Edict of Nantes. In it, the Huguenots lost their right to practice Calvinism. The overall results of this were mixed. Yes, religious unity was temporarily achieved, but it was at a severe economic cost. That's because about 200,000 Huguenots fled France for England, Holland, and even some of the English colonies in North America. So again, they're going to help those areas industrially and economically, while France will be left meddling in trying to deal with their crisis after the wars of Louis XIV, and the Huguenots will later give a lot of support to the Enlightenment and its ideals of religious tolerance. In terms of culture, all art, as we said, was regulated by Louis's royal academies, which were paid for by the crown, and all content was controlled propaganda style to spin a positive, glorious image of Louis. Here's some examples. Again, this is kind of Baroque art as well. There he is. Look at the high heels and just very, very glorious. But that was meant to show how powerful and sweet Louis XIV was. In the next episode, I'm going to introduce to you the Versailles system. So you're going to have to stay tuned for that one. But thanks for listening. Make sure you go back, review, add to your notes, and be ready to go for the next class. Thanks. Have a good day.